Hey, if you want access to the show notes and the transcripts and the links talked about as part of this episode, you can head to Seven. So the word all spelled out, SEVEN hyphen health.com/317. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist and a coach and an eating disorder expert, and I help people to fully recover. So before we get on with today's show, I just want to say that I'm currently taking on new clients. If you are living with an eating disorder and you would like to not be living with an eating disorder and you want to reach a place of full recovery, then I would love to help. If you put an email or send an email to info@7-health.com and put the word coaching in the subject line, I can then send over the details of how we can work together. And it doesn't matter how long this has been going on, whether this is something that started in the last couple of months or the last couple of years, way through to if this has been going on for multiple decades. So if you're wanting help, you can email info@7-health.com and put coaching in the subject line. So on today's show, it is a guest interview, and my guest today is Dr. Nicola Sykes. So Dr. Nicola Sykes is the author of the book No Period Now What and the host of the All In podcast. She has a PhD in computational biology from MIT. And after graduating, she worked for a biotechnology company while pursuing her dreams of a family, which were thwarted by a diagnosis of hypothalamic amenorrhea, or no periods. She spent the next 18 months trying to conceive and immerse herself in the research to learn how to recover from hypothalamic amenorrhea, or HA. And concurrently, she tried the medical route to pregnancy with multiple doctor's visits, injections, and ultrasounds, resulting only in failure. Ultimately, she was able to achieve a natural pregnancy. Since that time, Dr. Nicola Sykes has shared her knowledge to the path of recovery, helping hundreds of others to achieve their dreams of getting their period back and pregnancy. I've been aware of Nicola for a really long time. I've had her on the podcast twice before. This was when she was going with her married name, Dr. Nicola Rinaldi. And so she was on the show for episode 63, which was back in October 2016, and then episode 118, which was in May 2018. So it's 6+ years since her last appearance. And I'll put both of those original episodes into the show notes. And what I tried to do with this episode is I didn't want to just rehash those other episodes. Despite them being pretty old, they are still filled with good content. So I highly recommend going back and having a listen to both of those episodes. If HA is something that you're dealing with, those episodes still stand up. So go and have a listen to both of them. And so what we wanted to cover as part of this episode is one, since the last time I had a conversation with Nicola, she's put some updates to the book No Period Now What, which is an incredible. I think of it as the Bible for hypothalamic amenorrhea. So if you haven't read that, I highly recommend that you do. And so since our last conversation, there's been some updates to the book. So we talk about that. We talk about the changes that have taken place in the world of recovery. HA recovery, because a lot has changed over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. And so we cover some of the topics around that. We talk about contraception. This is a topic that Nicola started to write more about. She talks in the interview that she's been changing the book or creating different versions of the book for, I think it's German and French. And as part of that, she changed some of the content of the book and wrote a whole chapter on contraception. And she's now decided to put that into a single standalone book. She needs to do that in English, but that's what is coming. And so we talk about some of the research connected to that, some of the findings with it. We also then get into research in more of a broader sense and looking at how do you know who to trust when we're looking at research or the people who are talking about research. She talks about evaluating studies And so we have a conversation on this topic, and we also talk about social media. And this sort of overlaps with our conversation around evaluating research because social media, unfortunately, it's little sound bites and sometimes it removes a lot of the nuance, or people are going for very attention grabbing things when actually what was found might not be quite as attention grabbing, or we need to be adding some caveats to it. And so we have a conversation around that. There's many other topics that we hit as part of this, but it was lovely to have Nicola back on the show after so many years. I was on her podcast, the All In podcast recently, and that was a really great conversation. I've got lots of great feedback from it. And so what I'll do is I'll link to that one in the show notes as well. So if you haven't listened to that, you can also check it out. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Nicola Sykes. Hey, Nicola, welcome to Real Health Radio again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. It's always lovely to chat with you, Chris.
Yeah, it's been a long time. I went
Mhm.
back today and I was looking, and we did our first episode back in October 2016. So that's a very long time ago. And
It's a
then we
long
did
time.
another one in May 2018. So 6+ years. And then that's been it. And then I had
Yeah.
the lovely experience of being on your podcast earlier this year. And then, yeah, here we are
Yeah.
again. And I'm really
Yep.
glad because I think there's probably been a lot that's happened over these last 6 years that we can chat about.
Yes. Lots and lots of things.
Yes. Cool. So look, you are the author of No Period Now What? And since being on the show, I know there's been some updates to that book. So I definitely want to talk
Oh yeah.
about that and go through that. I know I want to cover about contraception. I know there's a discussion piece that you'd suggested, an area where there's going to be some things that people might not know about. So I would like to talk about that.
Yeah.
And then just talking really about the landscape of the HA, what's been happening,
Mm.
well, since our conversation, but also over the last sort of 10, 20 years, because I've noticed a lot of changes in that area, and I'm sure you've noticed a lot of changes. And so I think it'd be useful to chat about that. But yeah, I guess as a starting place for anyone who hasn't listened to our earlier episodes, and I will put them in the show notes, can you give
Mhm.
people a little introduction on who you are, what you do, that kind of thing?
Yes, absolutely. So my life now, my world is all about amenorrhea recovery and all of that. And it started from my own personal experience. So I lost my period. Well, I was on birth control pills, and then I didn't get my period back when I came off the birth control pills. And it turns out that it was almost certainly because in the last few months I was taking them, I was sort of getting ready to be pregnant. So I was sort of reading all over, just, about things to do to help with getting pregnant. And a lot of people were saying, like, oh, lose weight to have an easier chance of pregnancy, or lose weight to have a better pregnancy, oh, lose weight, lose weight, lose weight. And then there was also sort of the aesthetics of losing weight. I felt like there were some parts of my body that weren't sort of ideal, and people in my lab were going on a diet. So it was like everything kind of lined up. And so I decided to go on a diet, and I was exercising a ton because I loved it. I still play ice hockey. At the time, I was also playing volleyball and lifting weights and playing squash and just like super, super active. So I went on this diet. I was significantly under fueling for my body's daily needs. And then I went off the pill and didn't get my period. And that was back in the early 2000s. And there was essentially no publicly available information about HA at the time. So I went to my doctor, and she said, give it 3 months, because there's post-pill amenorrhea. And actually like to talk about that as well a little bit.
For sure.
And, so 3 months came and went, and I still didn't have a period. And so then we started doing more investigation. And, eventually, I think about 8 months later, she talked to a reproductive endocrinologist and told me that I had hypothalamic amenorrhea. So that was the first time that I had heard that term.
And maybe
So,
just give a definition because I
oh,
know that
yeah.
everyone feels like they've caught up and knows what this is, but there's going to be people listening
Yes.
who still
Yeah,
are
yeah.
new to that as a term.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's funny how when you live in a world, you just sort of like the terms become de rigueur to you, and you
Yes.
forget that not everyone knows what you know. So yeah, so hypothalamic amenorrhea is missing a menstrual period because of suppression of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a small part of your brain that is kind of like the control center. So it takes in inputs from all sorts of things. So it takes in sort of physical inputs like It has sensors for all sorts of different hormones, glucose, insulin, the hormones PYY, and another one that's generated when you eat fat or protein. It has sensors for estrogen and progesterone and thyroid hormone and, all the stress hormones. So it basically takes in all these inputs and then sends out other signals to control other parts of our body. So it controls the pituitary gland. And that is sort of the next master regulator of our reproductive system. So the pituitary gives off follicle stimulating hormone that then goes to your ovaries and causes your follicles to grow, your eggs to mature, and that leads to ovulation. So when your hypothalamus senses that you aren't getting enough energy or what have you, it will slow down and basically suppress other parts of your body. So one of the top things that it suppresses when you're underfueling is your reproductive system because of the slowdown or shutdown of your hypothalamus. So it sounds kind of technical, but really it's basically if you're underfueling or overexercising or extremely stressed, and usually it's usually a combination of those three things, then you end up losing your period. And it's basically your body's sort of cry for help. Like, I'm not feeling safe and happy right now. So I'm going to shut things down. And, I mean, in a biological purview, it's not an ideal time for pregnancy. Like, our bodies don't know about all the other things that we do. Like, they know about sort of the pregnancy aspect. And that's sort of the biological driver of a lot of things that our system does is, in hopes of reproduction to continue the species.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the background for what HA is. My doctor said, well, maybe you could eat a little bit more and maybe you could exercise a little bit less. So that's what I did because that's what I was told was the way forward. And then the reproductive endocrinologist told me, oh, you'll probably never have a regular period again because your periods were irregular when you were younger and, who knows. And so I ended up going down the path of fertility treatments. So I did 4 cycles of injectable medication in hopes of getting pregnant, and none of them worked very well. I mean, there were all sorts of things that went wrong. Which is the story for another time. But basically, I didn't get pregnant. And finally, we were going to do IVF, in vitro fertilization, because that is a fertility treatment that has a higher likelihood of success. And they wanted to put me on birth control while I was waiting for things to line up for the treatment. And I was like, nah, I'm not going on birth control. I want to be pregnant. Like, that's crazy. So I did not go on birth control, and I cut down my exercise quite significantly. And in that waiting period, I ovulated on my own and got pregnant. So that was, really exciting. I didn't have to do IVF, although I did for a later kid. Everything had kind of come together. I ended up going on bed rest while I was pregnant. And then I found a message board online about HA. And so I joined that because I had so much free time on my hands. And so then that led me to, after a while, people were saying, you know so much about this, you should write a book. And I looked around and there was nothing available. So I was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to do this. So it was a brand new direction for me. I trained in computational biology. I'd worked at a biotechnology company in drug development, considered going to medical school. And then I decided, no, I don't want to treat patients. And here I am, seeing clients almost every day. I call them clients instead of patients because I'm not an MD. And so sometimes I regret that decision. But, I would like to be able to prescribe medications for people, which I can't because I'm not an MD. But I do help guide people in speaking with their doctors, what things to ask for and that kind of thing.
The medical school route, because you may have then got indoctrinated into that way of thinking around this subject matter, and then it wouldn't have lined up in the way that it did.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to be able to write prescriptions though. Yeah, so then it took me 3 years to write the book. I sent out a survey to about 500 of the women that had been on that message board. And so I collected that data because there was so many questions that people had that, there was nothing in the medical literature and doctors didn't know. And so, things like, how long will it take to recover, and what hormonal changes can I expect, and all sorts of things. What are the physical symptoms? How do those change with working on recovery? So that I incorporated that as well as going into the medical literature and really doing a deep dive on a lot of how much do we actually need to eat in order to really support our body's daily needs, which is a lot higher than, what we're generally told.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I just put that all into a book. I put everything in there that I know. I mean, it starts with what is HA and then moves into recovery and then talks about fertility treatments for pregnancy and sort of really looking at those from the lens of somebody with HA because, a lot of the fertility treatments doctors don't they don't necessarily know the nuances for somebody with HA or coming out of HA. So it sort of incorporated some of that. And then pregnancy and postpartum and, living life after recovery. So it's all in the book. And it's been interesting because I've been really, I work with people along all different phases of those journeys. So sort of, some people that I work with have just discovered they have HA and they're sort of like, what do I do next? Other people are well into recovery and, maybe still not able to get pregnant. And so, I can work with them and sort of specifically dealing with the medical system and what doctors are going to tell them versus, what seems to work better for people that have had HA. And then I've actually had a lot of people coming to me recently who are postpartum and not getting their periods back and sort of wondering like what things might I be doing, what things might I change to sort of get my period back at this stage. So
Yeah. Well, look, it is an incredibly detailed book. I read it a long time ago. You sent me the most recent update, and I've gone through that as well. And yeah, it's great. And really, the first two episodes that we did together, we cover a lot of the stuff
yeah.
from that book. So we don't have time to cover all of it. And so I want to suggest that people go back and listen to those episodes because I think what would be more useful is just looking at how you've evolved since those last episodes that we
Mhm.
recorded and since the prior versions of the book and what's been added in there now based on either your clinical experience or more research or just you changing your viewpoint for some other reason.
Yeah, it's body size focused. So when I wrote the book, I was sort of very much still in the mindset of, smaller can, I don't even like talking about it really. Just sort of in the typical mindset of, larger bodies are not necessarily healthy. And, I would talk about like, okay, after you've recovered, you can lose weight again. And I really don't. I really don't like the focus on body size and what you look like. And so the first update really took out a lot of that kind of language.
Yeah.
So I said that I changed it to be more health at every size aligned,
Yeah.
not entirely. I mean, I do have numbers in there. I talk about BMI a little bit. I talk about, the number of calories a little bit. And that's really because I found that a lot of people, when they sort of came to me initially, numbers in there so that people kind of had a guideline of like if I'm at X BMI, then I need to go more than I think I might need to. And the numbers in the book, if you're interested, you can go there. I just prefer not to, I mean, it's like I find that keeping a focus on numbers is really detrimental.
Yeah.
I think it really needs to be much more about how your body feels, how your body is operating.
And I'd also say for you, there was so much of that research focus where you were asking all of these different questions. And so it then does make sense to say, hey, this percentage of respondents were in this BMI
Yeah.
range, or this was where people typically lost their period. And that doesn't say anything that that's going to happen exactly for you, but it's useful, relevant information to have. And hey, we've looked at when people are recovering on average, these are roughly the calories that someone could need. But again, there's a huge amount of variation because it's hard
Yeah.
to then just say you need to eat more or you need to do less exercise because those are very ambiguous
Yes.
words. And
Yes,
so
exactly.
it's that, okay, I'm going to give you some numbers to give a little bit of context here, but we're not living and dying by these.
Yes.
And yeah, we then need to work out, okay, what's important for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, around the calorie aspect, I always encourage people like maybe count for a few days so that you kind of have a general idea of where you should be and then stop counting. I think that I've recovery coach. So that's part of the change in the landscape since I wrote the book is that now this is a thing, being a period recovery coach. But she was saying that she had to take photos of her meals every day and post them on a private account on Instagram. And then this person would check and I'm not really sure what the goal is there, but you just eat and you just eat because you enjoy it and you eat because it fuels your body. And it's not about, I have this many macros and I have this many calories and my plate has to look like this. It's like different things happen on different days and one day you can eat more and one day you can eat less and that's fine. And so I think that that's part of what I don't like about sort of any kind of focus on numbers. It's like, yeah, you need to know how much you generally need to eat, but you don't need to be eating that exact amount every single day. You can eat a little bit more one day and a little bit less the next day, and it all kind of comes out in the wash.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And also, like, you're writing a book for a really wide audience. And what I mean by that is, like, yes, everyone who's reading the book is either like struggling with HA themselves or they're a practitioner. And so, yes, this is a niche topic, but within that, there are a wide array of experiences. And so,
yeah.
even just hearing what you said there about, okay, we don't necessarily want food to be focused, for some clients, that is exactly where my focus is, because that's the most
Hmm.
important thing at that
Oh,
stage.
yeah.
And for
Yes.
someone else, we're
Yes.
past that and we're looking a lot more at the variety piece, or we're looking a lot more at the psychological flexibility piece of spontaneity and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so it's hard when you're writing a book because otherwise it's going to turn into like 1,200 pages because you're giving so many different options of, well, if this is your scenario or this is your
Yes.
scenario. So I
Yeah.
get like it's a hard task because whatever you say, someone will be able to know. But what about in this scenario? And so, yeah, you kind of walk the line of I need to talk about this in a general sense. And if people want to get into even more specifics, that is when you then work with a recovery coach, or that is
Yeah.
when you work with
Yes.
you or me,
Yeah.
depending on what's important and relevant for that person.
Yeah. So the second update of the book was sort of two major things. One was just making the book less pregnancy focused. When I first wrote the book, it was, or in the early 2000s when I was experiencing HA, that not having a period was problematic. And so it only becomes a problem when you want to get pregnant, and you can't get pregnant when you're not ovulating and having a period. So when I first wrote the book, it was very pregnancy focused, but there are a lot of people now, younger people, people who don't ever want to get pregnant, but understand that having a menstrual cycle is actually quite important for us, for our overall well-being, and also as a sign of our overall well-being. So it's sort of twofold there. And so I made it a lot less pregnancy focused in this iteration. So there's still plenty of information about pregnancy, but the goal in the first section is really about period restoration and health restoration, and not so much about pregnancy. Just so that it's for a more broad audience.
And is that also because there's been a shift in the people who are searching for this information from a demographic standpoint? Because I think, as you said, for a lot of people, the thing that has alluded them to the fact that they're not getting their period is the fact that I'm now trying to get pregnant. I've just come off birth control and it's just not happening for me. It's not, my period hasn't come back. Versus now, it's a lot younger people or all across the age spectrum where this has become more of a thing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's just not everybody wants to get pregnant. And so taking away that focus and just making it more about the actual process of recovery was, I thought was a useful thing to do. And then the other thing is I just made it a little bit less gendered, just recognizing that there can be people who were assigned female at birth who, maybe don't fit that mold anymore, the non-binary or even trans. And they can also experience hypothalamic amenorrhea. And so, rather than saying women and girls, not girls, women and, just sort of using gendered words everywhere, I just made it a little bit less gender focused. So that was important for me. I want to support everybody across the spectrum in feeling safe and happy in the body that you're in. And so I think that's it just felt right to me to make those changes.
Okay, cool. And that, look, that makes sense. And it feels like I want to talk to you about how it feels like the recovery space has changed over this time because I've noticed quite a few changes, but I would love to hear from you on what you've noticed, and then we can get into the contraceptive piece.
There's so much more awareness these days of the importance of having a period, and even not just a period. Like, I think that sometimes the period is the physical act of bleeding. It's not actually what's important. The important thing is the ovulation, which comes somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks before the period, depending on, various factors. That there are a lot of benefits that those hormonal changes have for us, and many fewer people are coming to me saying, "Oh, my doctor didn't think it was important that I had a period, and the you just go on birth control." I'm really noticing that a lot more physicians these days are saying, "You probably need to be eating more, and you probably need to be cutting your exercise." They may not be giving specific guidelines still, but at least it's, I think that there's a lot more awareness in the medical community that this is a problem. And some of that comes, possibly from my work and people going to their doctors and saying, "Oh, I read about this, and what do you think?" There has also been more research in the area, and sort of the development of the paradigm of the relative energy deficiency in sport, which is essentially HA. It's just that the amenorrhea is a symptom of relative energy deficiency in sport. REDS is the symptom. In my book, I talk about like all the other things that can be happening, GI distress and anxiety and, trouble with, hair and nails and all those things. Those all fall under the umbrella of REDS. So it's just sort of another way of talking about it. But there is a lot more research going on, and we're learning more. So, I do want to plug a new study that I'm actually hopefully going to participate in, but it's run through the Mayo Clinic.
Cool.
It's an HA registry, so you can learn more about it at the link noperiod.info/registry, and sign up at noperiod.info/reveal, which is the name of the study. So it's basically just the Mayo Clinic is collecting people who have HA, and you'll get a survey. It's all survey based, but you can also get a blood kit to actually send in and get your hormone levels tested, so you can have a confirmation of your diagnosis through that methodology. But so it's just sort of to have a collection of people who have experienced HA so that we can ask questions about recovery and, some of the more long-term questions. Like, a lot of people are coming to me now, like, I'm 50 now, and so I'm perimenopausal. My last period was 2 months ago, so maybe menopause. I don't know, not quite there yet, but we don't know if there's been any impact of having had HA on the timing of menopause or how menopause feels, anything like that.
Yeah.
So this kind of registry will help us with answering those sorts of questions. So if any of your listeners currently have HA, please go check that out and sign up, because I think the more people we can get, the better.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I'll definitely put those links in the show notes. And in some senses, it sounds like they're wanting to do what you did on a small scale en masse. So rather than have like 500 people on a message board, it's can we get 10,000, 100,000, whatever it ends
Yeah.
up being, so we can start to look at it and have it be more of a longitudinal study. And as you say, like it would be really interesting to have a look at what does happen in terms of like menopause and okay, does it get earlier that menopause occurs because of HA? Does it have no impact? Yeah, it would be really interesting to have that information.
Said there have been, a lot of people who have seen the value in encouraging people to live a life that's not constrained by food and exercise, where food and exercise are part of your life, but not your whole life. As I said, there are a lot of period recovery coaches out there these days, which I think is fabulous. I think that the more people we have that are sort of helping to guide others through this process, the better. There are some things that I hear, people tell me that their coach says this, that, or the other thing, and it sort of drives me a little bit batty. But I think all in all, it is beneficial to have more people working in this area. And
Yeah, I'm in agreement up until a point. Like there's
uh-huh.
a big part of me that sees that this has been an avenue that a lot of people have gone into, and a lot of people gone into that still have some disordered stuff of their
Mm,
own. that
Hmm.
is going on, and maybe because it's typically someone who recovered from HA and then becomes a coach. It's rare, and I know I'm like the rare person to have not had an eating disorder and yet do this work.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the recovery coaches, or I'd even say most, it's similar situation to you. I didn't have my period, I got it back, I learned some stuff, and now I want to teach some people. And
Yeah.
some people go into a lot more detail in terms of learning stuff like you have, and other people do less level of detail. But
Yeah.
I think the problem that I see is that you can get your period back and still have some very disordered stuff
Yes.
around food, around your body, around exercise. And that then has an impact on how you coach people and the information that you give out in terms of, do you need to take time off from exercise, or what
Yeah.
should be the upper limit in terms of the amount of calories that someone should take in, or a whole host of other questions that someone has. And that then has an impact on all of the people that they work with, all of the information that they put out. And
Yeah.
I think, like, I know I have my biases, and we all do. And since we did our first podcast, what, nearly 8 years ago, I've gone a lot more down the route of eating disorders than I
Yeah.
was before. It was probably a lot more dieting, disordered eating, some eating disorders, and now it's just really working all of the time with people with eating disorders and long-standing eating disorders. And my big worry in that HA community, and I'm talking sort of
Yeah.
globally, is
Yeah.
that there are a lot of people who are using the label of, oh, I diet, or I use disordered eating, or I've got a bit of a complicated relationship with exercise, when the actual correct descriptor is, you have an eating disorder.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of that that's going on, of I just need to do what I need to do to get my period back and everything will be fine. And
Yeah.
it's like you're missing the forest for the trees. Like, this is
Yeah.
one small symptom in this vast array of other symptoms that are going on. And you just getting back your period is not going to repair everything you think it's going to
Yeah.
repair. And I
Yeah.
guess that's my concern with a
Hmm.
lot of the HA recovery space,
Yeah.
is that people are missing the seriousness of it. Like, it's great that people understand the seriousness of getting a period,
Hmm.
but I think people need to understand the seriousness of not having an eating disorder and
Yeah.
recognizing I do have an eating disorder.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really challenging. I mean, I've had some people say to me that like everybody in my support group has an eating disorder. And so could
And look,
you
let me just say, like, I'm not going to make a black and white statement, like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
everyone in your group has, because I don't think that
Yeah.
that is true either. I think it's happening to a much higher degree
Mhm.
than most people are aware of.
Yeah. So are there sort of pointers that you look at that would have you more concerned with a particular person than not? Like what are the things that would
And so
yeah.
often when I'm working with someone, or not so often, like anytime that I'm working with someone, I'm going through a very detailed form to understand what's going on. If they've got blood work done, I'm going through the blood work. And in so many cases, you learn the seriousness by what's your ability like to do the opposite.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because from my perspective, the eating disorders are anxiety disorders, and they're about avoidance. And the more challenge that someone has in saying, okay, I can recognize that this is a problem, I'm going to stop it. The more challenge that someone has with that is probably an indicator,
Hmm.
okay, this is something that's more serious. And the reality is, I don't really care about a label. When I
Yeah.
say I think more people have eating disorders, it's not because I want to give them that label. It's more recognizing the seriousness of what's going on, and that it's not just about, oh, I'm doing a little too much exercise, or I'm just eating a little less than I should be. It's like, no, this
Yeah.
is having more of an impact than just
Yeah.
that. So it's hard for me to give you a clear answer of like, oh, if
Mhm.
these things are happening. But it's typically that you're not just missing your period. Like,
Oh yeah.
it's that there are all of these other pieces that are going on that is
Yeah.
having an impact in terms of your body having to turn things off and turn things down.
Yeah.
And even with like the red S stuff, I love that there's more of an attention on it. But even with that, like red S, for anyone who doesn't know, red S was brought in to then replace the old female athlete triad. And they did that for a number of reasons. One, because they recognized that it didn't just affect females or women, but two,
Yeah.
they realized that it wasn't just about a triad of things. This was
Yeah. There's a
affecting
lot more
all of
to
the
it.
different
Yes.
symptoms and systems of the body.
Yeah.
But what I've seen happen with this is that Redist becomes the thing in the middle, and then so the energy is the thing that's driving it, and then there's all of these other areas that it affects, and it basically just lists all of the different systems within the body, which is
Yeah.
fine because I totally believe that eating disorders are about being in a low energy state. But then there's like this one little box that says psychological,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that's doing a
Bigger.
disservice to how much this isn't
Yeah.
just a little one of the other spokes, that actually this is a really big component of it. And I think it then minimizes that part of it, of like, okay, that, like, yeah, the energy piece is the thing that's driving, but I think there's this other thing that is creating that situation.
Yeah. There's a lot of fear. And, fear is what drives diet culture. Like we're told to be afraid of being in a certain body size and afraid of the health impacts. And so that leads to fear of food, fear of gluten and fear of dairy and fear of carbs. And like it's all very like an encouragement and support and giving people accurate information, letting them make choices. People can decide if they want to take longer or less time, all of that. Everybody's different. Everybody has their own journey. Like I feel like our bodies are quite resilient. And
Yep.
so once we're in a space where we're fueling our bodies well and we're moving for, the right reasons, quote unquote, not sort of exercising every single day because if you don't exercise, then things are going to fall apart, sort of allowing yourself to take time off when you need to, all of those things. And then our bodies just, they will settle down. They will, like, I don't think about my period at all, except for the fact that I'm perimenopausal. And so, I've had 6 or 7 21-day cycles. And it's like, okay, fine. I have a 21-day cycle. That's where I'm at. There's this feeling that your cycle has to be perfect and that everything has to be perfect. And I think that really speaks to what you were just talking about. Like, I really push people to get away from the idea of perfection.
Yep.
Perfection is not necessary in pretty much anything in life. When you're searching for perfection, I think it really puts so much pressure and stress on us. So I really encourage people to be, sometimes your cycle is going to be 28 days, sometimes it might be 30. You might get sick and maybe you miss an ovulation. Like that's all normal and expected. And so I think there's just this message that if your cycle isn't 28 days, something's wrong. And, it's like, nah, I don't really agree with that. And so it's just,
Yeah.
I think I really, really dislike the use of fear to try and get people to buy something, to do something, I think that's part of what I see as a problem in sort of the period recovery space. And I mean, honestly, life in general.
Yeah, it's a hard one because there's times where you're wanting, like, especially if I'm thinking about eating disorder recovery, you want to not, I don't think I want to use fear, but I want someone to be in touch with the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, let's actually have a look at what's going on in your life right now, because you're saying you feel like everything's fine and you don't need to recover, but let's actually look at, okay, are
Hmm.
you able to do these handful of things? Are you still getting these symptoms? Okay, fine. Well, this would indicate that maybe there is still some work to be done in terms of your recovery. And so from that side, it feels like, okay, we're not using fear, we're just trying to sidestep the eating disorder thoughts and bring some reality in here. But I agree with you because there's no point telling someone of like, this is going to be the worst thing, and in your 70s you're going to be so regretting this and all of the damage it's going to do to your bones, and maybe you'll get Alzheimer's, and like, just that just doesn't work. I mean,
Yeah.
apart from the fact that it makes people miserable and feel lousy about themselves, it also doesn't work as a way of getting someone to change. Like maybe they do that on day one, but after day two, day three, week two, week four, like it just stops working.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's important to have an accurate understanding of those things. Like, yes, those can happen, but also, a lot of the consequences of HA specifically are reversible.
Yep.
There's so much that our bodies can do to repair and restore and, come back to an equilibrium. It's tough. It's a tough, I think it's really the search for perfection
Yep.
that I have a problem with, and the idea that perfection is the goal.
Yeah. which again possibly speaks to if someone was become a recovery coach after recovering from their own HA stuff and they're being very evangelical about this kind of perfectionism, it's probably telling us about that person and how they feel
Mhm.
about those things, and that's then having an impact on the way that they coach. Because yes, I think there is a lot of overlap between someone who develops HA and perfectionism or someone who develops an eating disorder and perfectionism. It's not always the case. That's often the case of
Yeah.
what does happen. What else have you noticed in this space over the last however many years?
I don't think there's anything else that comes to mind right now.
Okay. I guess
Yeah.
the only other thing that I want to mention, and I don't know if it's connected to this, but it's just front of mind because I
Mhm.
see it happen so often. And it's just a reminder that just because you've got your period back does not tell you that everything is done. Because
Oh,
I think
absolutely.
this is
Yes.
a real mistaken thing. And people
Yeah.
have been definitely told this of like, okay, once you get your period, okay, you don't need to gain any more weight, or you can now go straight back to exercise, or you don't need to be eating what you were eating before, or all of this stuff. And I really want people to get that all that has happened is your body has change so that there are now certain hormones that are being
Mhm.
produced at a level that mean that you are bleeding. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're ovulating. It all means is that you're getting a period. And that it isn't that if your body is looking at all the things that it needs to do and there's 100 things, the 100th thing is not getting your period back. Like it's not the
Mhm.
last thing your body will ever do. And so there can be a lot more repair that still needs to take place, even if you've got your period come back.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think two things come to mind as you say that. So, one is I really, really, really encourage people to learn about ovulation tracking and track your ovulation going forward. It's useful really for the rest of your life. It's useful for understanding how your body is reacting to any changes that you're making with exercise or eating after recovery. It's useful if you're trying to get pregnant or avoid pregnancy. It's useful as you get older for understanding what's going on with your cycle, in perimenopause or what have you. It's just a good barometer, much better than your period, because as you say, you can get your period without ovulating. And if you're not ovulating, but you're getting a bleed, it's still, there's something that your body is trying to tell you. So it's really, really useful information. Big differences. And I think that's actually a fairly big driver of sort of that difference in people
Yeah.
is, some of us have much more robust reproductive systems than others. There are proteins that bind to other proteins in our brains, in our bodies. If you have a little bit of a mismatch, which is like single nucleotide polymorphisms, it's very, very scientific, but basically it's just what makes each of us a different person is like your ancestors have slightly different changes in their DNA from my ancestors, and that might make my reproductive system more sensitive. So that means I lose my period more easily and I get it back more slowly. Somebody else might have a much more robust system. And so, if they're coming back from HA, then they get their period back quite early because like their proteins all match together really well. And so as soon as things are kind of even close to the way that they should be, then, it all works together, operates best. And that means just generally eating enough most days, and same thing with exercise. Like exercise is really, really healthy for us. It's so good for us when it's on the background of a well-nourished body. Exercise in an undernourished body maybe is causing more problems than it's solving. But for the long term, I think exercise is great, ongoing work, because we do know that you don't have to exercise every day. It's generally being well nourished. It's generally moving your body. And though, that's sort of where you'll find a place of sort of both physical health and, I mean, obviously there are other issues that can be happening like disease states and what have you. Really challenging for people. And I think that is part of recovery as well, is getting to a place where if something unexpected happens in your day and you don't get to eat the things that you were planning on, no big deal. And if it is a big deal for you, then I think that is something that, you will benefit from working on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like with so much of this stuff, context matters. Like
Yeah.
there are points where you talk about that exercise is a very healthy thing. And I completely agree with you. If someone is well nourished, well rested, is taking enough energy so that the body can repair and actually adapt from the exercise, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And when the body's not in that state, then it's not helpful. It's
Yeah.
like we don't, the guy who's just broken both his legs, we're not saying, hey, let's talk about the importance of getting 10,000 steps
Yes.
in. It's like,
Yes.
this is the wrong
Absolutely.
context. Let's focus
Yeah.
on your legs being able to heal. And then once they've healed, then we can have a conversation around what could be appropriate exercise
Yeah.
for you. And at that stage, we're probably going to need to do some rehab so that those legs start to work properly and then build up to that thing. And I think so often that gets lost or forgotten or gets
Yeah.
twisted, and people only hear what they want to hear, or the eating disorder will only let someone hear what they want to hear, or whatever it may be. And so I do think the context piece with all of this is super important.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so, yeah, let's talk about reproduction and contraceptives
Mhm.
because, yeah, this is something you said that you'd like to cover. And I know, I think you've been writing a chapter of a book or a course or
Yes.
something or other. So, yeah, tell
Yeah.
us
Yeah. Yeah.
more as a bit of a setup, and then we can get into it.
Yes. I've had a lot of people come to me after HA just wondering what they might use for contraception. People are generally have this sort of negative feeling about the hormonal birth control because a lot of people, when they went to the doctor and said, I'm not getting my period, they're like, oh, have the birth control, go on the pill. It'll give you a period. It'll make everything better. Or for contraception, which, so there can be valid reasons for using birth control, and it shouldn't be used as a band-aid, in my humble opinion. Like,
Yeah.
we should figure out what's going on that's, causing you to have irregular or absent menstrual cycles rather than just throwing the birth control pill at you. But so anyway, so people were coming to me after having recovered their period and wondering what they might use for contraception. So I've done a fair bit of research into the different types of contraception that are available for that reason. So when I was working with Florence and Svea and Maybrit and a whole bunch of other people to translate the book into French and German, I decided to add in a chapter about contraception. So the French and German versions don't have the section on fertility treatments and pregnancy and postpartum because that felt like a lot to translate all at once. I mean, the book is quite big, and so we ended up doing a smaller volume for sort of more talking about HA recovery and what you need to understand about a menstrual cycle and all of that. But so I added the contraception chapter into that. I haven't yet put it into the English version. So what I'm thinking is that I will publish it as a separate little ebook or book, so that people who've already got the book can just have the section on contraception, and it'll be, hopefully it'll be more widely available. So my German translators actually said that they would like it as a separate standalone thing because they have friends coming to them and saying, "What should I do about contraception?" And they wanted to be able to provide this information to them. So I sort of go through in this book, we'll call it a book. I keep calling it a chapter because that was its origin, but I am going to publish it as a separate book. So I go through all the different types of contraception from, there's non-hormonal contraception, there's hormonal contraception. There are some of the hormonal contraceptives like the hormonal IUD, for example. I had myself for about 10 years. It's not unusual to actually ovulate while you have that hormonal the IUD, and so you can still get the benefits of the estradiol and progesterone changes from a menstrual cycle, but also have the contraceptive effects, and the IUD in particular thins the uterine lining so that you have very little bleeding, which periods can be a little messy and challenging. And so, if you're on a contraceptive that can have you still ovulating but not bleeding, that seems like not the worst thing in the world to me. So it's just, so I really lay out all the different options, how they affect your ovulation, how they might affect your bone density, because that's particularly important for somebody that might have had HA for a long time, starting at a young age, and does have perhaps lower bone density. So just sort of thinking about all the different types of possible methods of contraception from that lens of, are you still ovulating? Can you still ovulate? What happens with your bone density? And, just really giving people that information so that they can make a choice for themselves. I also think it's really important to be having this discussion with your doctor so that you can, get more information from them as well, because obviously there's so much out there about contraception. I can't possibly include everything, but just talking about like some of the side effects and what's sort of known side effects, what might be less well known, but I think it's important for people to know about. So there's the potential for blood clots. There's potential for depression. There are potential for some nutritional deficiencies. All of that out for people to understand and make a choice that works for them and where they are in their life, and whether they're trying to conceive or not trying to conceive. And I mean, obviously, you're not on birth control if you're trying to conceive, but maybe if it's sort of in the near term future versus the longer term future, that kind of thing.
Okay, sounds great. So I'll look forward to when that actually comes out. And my
Yeah.
French and German is not up to par, so I'll need that to be English.
Yeah.
And I want
Yeah.
to talk about some of the research connected to this, but just for people listening, is there any, I mean, you've given some little tips in terms of the hormonal IUD and IUD that people might not know of. Like, is there anything else that you can think of that comes to mind that you're like, hey, I would really love your listeners to just walk away with this fact or this thing that I like either I didn't know and this was really great as part of my research, or I know this, but not many other people seem to know this, or this is the thing that people are always so interested about when they do find out. Anything that comes to mind?
I didn't know until recently was for the birth control pills. If somebody is choosing to take birth control pills, it is much better from sort of the perspective of your body to actually take the extended birth control pill, so the continuous. So I think you're either just on it continuously, or I think there's maybe a 7-day break out of 3 months. So rather than taking a break every month, it seems to be better to be on the birth control pill as much as possible. And the rationale for that is that it's supplying your body with, estradiol and progesterone, or maybe just progesterone, but it's doing that. If you're taking a week break out of every month, that's 25% of the time that you're not getting that support for your bones or, brain or whatever it is. So being on it continuously basically keeps your hormones a little bit more stable and seems to be better, particularly for bone density. So as being on hormone replacement therapy with the bioidentical hormones. So the bioidentical hormones, you're generally not supposed to use those as birth control because you can ovulate while you're on them. Although somebody who has HA is not ovulating on any of these things. So this, pill, and so just knowing that the continuous is probably better for you than taking that week break every month, which is just really from historical purposes, sort of when the birth controls were originally designed, it was, so that people didn't worry about whether they were pregnant or not. It's just like you still got your monthly bleed, and it's really not, there's no real purpose for that bleed anymore. So does that make sense?
It does, and it surprises me. And the
Mhm.
reason it surprises me is like if I think of that gap week, and for anyone taking the pill, they're still taking there's still the last week of pills. It's just the placebo
But
pill,
yeah,
correct? It's just the
yes,
one that doesn't have anything in it.
yes.
And so I thought that part of the rationale with was that you're then in some way mapping on what happens when you do get a normal menstrual cycle. So that part of the reason you get the bleed is because your progesterone and your estrogen have dropped down enough that it's now not sustaining that uterine lining, and the uterine lining then sheds. And so by having this week of doing that, you're trying to mimic the body, and that's then a good thing because that's what happens naturally, or whatever, however you want to phrase it.
Yeah, there's actually no benefit to shedding your menstrual line, to shedding your uterine lining, to shed, the lining of your gut, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. Like it's just sort of the cells are constantly breaking down and rebuilding and all of that. So you don't need a bleed for any like clean out purposes or anything like that. Really, the focus on getting your period back is not about the bleed. It's about the hormonal changes that come with ovulation. Like that's what's important. And so when you're on the continuous birth control pill, it's not the same as having a natural cycle, but the hormones are enough to sort of maintain your bone density, which is important for some people. And, contraception is important. I think that it is really being able to control when you get pregnant. It's just opened up so much of the world to people who have, people with uterus.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a lot of negativity around hormonal contraception. I think it's warranted in some ways and not warranted in other ways. So I think that the hormonal contraceptives can be really useful for people. The copper IUD, you do continue to ovulate. I think there are probably slightly fewer downsides to the copper IUD, but it can make your menstrual bleeds much heavier. And so that can present a challenge for some people. I personally chose the Mirena because I've not had bad experiences with hormonal birth control in the past, other than the misinformation I haven't had negative experiences with hormonal birth control personally. Some people have. So there are options. But I chose the Mirena because I liked the idea of not having a monthly menstrual bleed, which sounds kind of crazy for somebody who's helping people get their periods back. But as I've been saying, it's not the bleed itself that's important. And I really liked that I continued to ovulate, but didn't have sort of the mess and bother of the monthly bleed. Those can certainly be useful for people who don't want to be on hormonal birth control or the copper IUD. So it's just nice to have a good sense of what all the different options are and recognize that, hormonal birth control can be right for some people and it's not right for everybody. And there are lots of options. And, so I really just tried to make the information as accessible as possible, as possible without.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it would be then useful to chat about the research part of it. So when you're going through, and I don't know what's the best way to phrase this as a question, so I'm happy for you to take it in some different direction if you want to answer it slightly differently, but how do you work this out? Like when you're looking at research, how are you going through it? Not all studies are created equal. So how do you figure out, okay, this one I'm putting a lot more faith in, and this one, or not faith, I don't need faith. It's like I've
Yes.
got the information it contains is telling me everything I need to know versus, well, this is kind of dubious and there's these questions that aren't really answered, or I don't like that they've done this type of analysis because of the way that it can skew this thing or that thing. Like, I'm not a researcher. I know that I have certain limitations around things, which is in a sense why a lot of the time I'm outsourcing that to people that I trust. And so, yeah, for you who is doing a lot of that interpretation of the research, like what's your process, or how do you determine these things?
Yeah, I love that question. When I'm looking into a topic, I'll go into the medical literature. I go to PubMed and I just do a global search and I see what comes up. So I'll usually start by reading what's called a review article. So that's basically somebody who works in the field who's taken a look at a wide variety of the published literature and sort of synthesized it. So they do a lot of the work for you, a sort of a focus, but they go through research on, different sides of an issue. So, on hormonal birth control, for example, I like a review because it sort of points me in the different directions of things that might be important to look at, gives me a good idea of what research is already out there. And sort of, a summary of what these particular scientists think is, the right path forward. I do think there's a little bit of faith involved. I mean, you have to, I do think our knowledge is constantly evolving. I don't think that there is like ground truth. I mean, there obviously is ground truth, but we don't necessarily know what that is. Like we're constantly learning, we're constantly figuring out new things. I mean, I just saw a Facebook post of people from my high school who were saying, remember when there was a smoking room? And I'm like, oh my God, like I can't imagine there being smoking in my children's high school. But, different times. We know a lot more about smoking now than we did back then. So yeah, so I'll start with a review article. And then if there's specific things that I'm interested in, I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into looking at studies that focus specifically on that one aspect. So I tend to look at meta-analyses. So these are basically articles where they've basically collected the data from a number of different studies and analyzed all of those data together. So that gives you, that helps take out some of the individual study bias. So you're sort of looking at, okay, over these 10 studies or these 15 studies, what's the overall conclusion that I can draw from all of these different people, all of these different research subjects, all of these different ways of running the experiment. So that is a place where I feel reasonably confident when I'm looking at a meta-analysis that, this is probably right. I mean, again, not always, because we can get things wrong. And depending on how the experiment is run, how the study is run, you might be introducing bias. I think the meta-analyses are the best place to look to have the least biased answer about what we know today. Individual studies, I think that the type of study that sort of gives us the best answer are the double-blind studies. So those are where neither the researchers nor the patient's subjects know which formulation they're being given. Because if you know, then you can have sort of ideas in mind about what might happen. And so you might be more likely to report a specific type of side effect if you know that you're on a medication and it might have these types of side effects. There's sort of some bias in, some cognitive bias that can come into play. So double-blind studies are best, but I like to go and look at a couple of different studies because, you don't always get, each researcher has their own bias, and so they might be reporting the data in a certain way that be. And then the data that I like the least is anecdotal data. So that's sort of one person comes along and says, hey, this happened to me. Trying to draw any kind of cause and effect from one individual person's story, I think, is really challenging. They didn't even post that. They posted that there was evidence of the hormonal IUD causing things that are sort of related to androgens. So increased hairiness, increased acne, more hair loss, more hair loss on your head, increased hairiness in other places. So sort of some of the things that might be symptoms of PCOS or just general, having too much, too many androgens in a female body. And so this person said, message me, write IUD to get more information. And so she actually did share the study, which, kudos on that. The study said there's a tenfold increase in these side effects. Hirsutism was the one in particular in people with a hormonal IUD over a copper IUD. And I was like, what? That makes, that seems crazy because that's suggesting that there's, all these people out there that are having this hirsutism from the hormonal IUD, and I've never even heard of that. And it was based on a database where people report side effects of medications. So they compared the number of reports of these androgen-related issues from people with hormonal IUDs versus copper IUDs. And so they're saying there's a tenfold higher rate. And I'm like, no. You can't say that because you don't know, who is reporting. You don't know that there's any kind of cause and effect. The idea that there is a tenfold higher rate of these things it doesn't hold water. So it could be the case that because it's a hormonal IUD, people sort of have this idea that there might be hormonal symptoms. And so they notice a little bit of extra hair on their chin and they think, oh, that's because of the IUD. So they go and report it. Whereas somebody with a copper IUD who might notice a little bit of extra hair on their chin, they don't have this bias that, oh, it might be related to the IUD. So they don't bother reporting it. So I think that using user reports can be a place where you can get an idea of something to look at in controlled studies, but you can't say that there's a tenfold higher risk of, or higher rate of hirsutism just because it's, you don't know who's reporting. There's just so much that's unknown and uncontrolled. So I think that kind of thing really sets my teeth on edge. Also, the article was not published in a peer-reviewed journal, so that means it hasn't been looked at by other scientists. And there's sort of a general anti-science bias in the world at the moment, but I do think that there is value to having people who have been trained to look at these are the kinds of things that you should be saying that can make a good study, and these are the kinds of things that make a more suspect study, and how have we done on those markers?
Like preliminary a study where you're like, okay, this seems interesting. Now let's put this into the
Yes.
double-blind controlled study to actually get a sense of does this cause what it looks like it may be causing.
I did actually find a research study that looked at hormone levels of people on the hormonal implant. I think it was the Depo-Provera shot and the copper IUD. And they did find that there was an increase in free testosterone in people who had the hormonal implant. So that is a mechanism by which there might be these changes between the implant and the IUD, in that the implant has a higher amount of hormones and it's more systemically acting versus the locally acting IUD. So, there is a difference there. But so, I like to share information, but sort of put a little bit of caveat around it rather than saying, oh my gosh, you should have your hormonal ID taken out right now because you might get a little bit of extra hair. Like, no, not so much. So I think that as you said before, it's context. And, we all have different experiences with medications. We all have different metabolism of different medications. And so everybody's unique and different. And so you kind of have to so you sort of take this global idea of like, what do we generally know, and then figure out what works best for you.
Yeah. And so as the consumer then of that Instagram post that you
Mhm.
alluded to, like they can figure this thing out because not everyone is a researcher. The vast majority of people aren't researchers.
Yeah.
And it's then very hard when someone sees a post like that, especially if it's a post from someone who's credible. Like I see so much
Yeah.
online about like Huberman, and his podcast is absolutely ginormous
Mhm.
in the sort of science health sphere, and so many people love him. So many people have real negative things to say about how he's not doing proper science and his research, and so
Mhm.
it's hard when there is this authority bias. Like this person
Yeah.
works at
Yes.
Stanford, for example, and so he should know this stuff and he's really smart, so we should believe him. And I imagine that there's a lot of people who are then doing the same thing on Instagram that you're talking about. So as a consumer, is there any advice that you would give to say like how do you start to determine whether this is accurate or not?
Yeah. I mean, I think things that are super surprising are less likely to be valid, honestly. So
Yeah.
I think that if something really surprises you, if something seems outrageous, then it's definitely worth digging in a little bit more and seeing, where is this coming from? Is there other evidence that's provided? Even looking at the comments and just seeing, I mean, I commented on this post that, I think that it would have been useful to provide this kind of information. I think it's on the people who are authorities to really provide their sources, to provide, to talk about like, this is why I think this is interesting. This is why I think, these are some of the caveats around it. I think that is really important. I always try and put in caveats when I'm sharing things that I'm, maybe not certain about. So I think that it is a really challenging question. I mean, knowing that, sort of this hierarchy of studies, like peer-reviewed studies are definitely more likely to be accurate than things that are just posted online. If somebody's not providing sources, then that really gets my hackles up. Like, I think if you're going to talk about, something that you've learned, tell people where you found it so that other people can go and check you. If you're just sharing vicious, and, there's a fair bit of science journalism that doesn't share studies. And so I'm much more skeptical of those. Like if you're not going to tell me, if you're not going to tell me where you got this information, I look at it with a much more skeptical eye. So I really like when science writers link to the studies that they're talking about so that I can go and look at the study if I want to. Do I always? No. But if I'm sort of like, that doesn't make sense, then I can go and look at it versus having to go and, figure out what study they're even talking about. So I think that that's providing sources is something at least that sort of your general layperson can look at and be like, okay, well, they have sources that, I could go and look at, or somebody else can go and look at versus, just making statements that,
Yeah.
where did that come from?
Yeah, for sure. I guess the my knee-jerk reaction when said if something seems surprising, like maybe not so, I think that's how most people think about health at every size.
Uh-huh.
And that's their knee-jerk reaction of, hang on, we've been told for so long that being overweight or obese or whatever term people want to use is someone healthy, and you're now telling me that that's not the case, or they shouldn't be
Yeah.
focused on losing
Yeah.
weight. And so I think that in that instance, there is something that is going to be very surprising for someone to hear that the first time.
But there's also a lot of studies that you can point to
Totally.
that back it up.
Yes.
So yeah, yes.
Yeah.
It's not just one study. It's not just one Instagram post. Like there's a lot. So I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at with the meta-analysis and sort of looking at what the general research sense is. And I mean, obviously, there's a lot of research that is on the side of larger bodies equals unhealthy. I mean, there is a lot of scientific research that purports to support that. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, that's where we're sort of in this process of evolution, and there, like why I say there is a ground truth in that there's sort of the underlying biology, and whatever it is, it is. But our understanding of that, I don't think there is like truth, quote unquote. I think that there's things that have more evidentiary support and things that have less evidentiary support and things that have absolutely no evidentiary support. And those
Yeah.
are the ones that, you can really probably throw away. Misplaced a little bit. I mean, so I do think that, I took a course when I was doing my PhD on reading and understanding medical literature. So we were guided through a number of different articles and, look at what are the strong points of this article, what are the strong points of the research, where are their failures, what things are they missing, where did they go wrong, and, who's paying them. I mean, that's not unreasonable to look at,
Yeah.
because we all have biases. And so really understanding where those biases might be coming from, each of us doing our best to share what our biases are and control for them. But, obviously we're all humans, so we're doing the
Yeah.
best we can.
Yeah, and I think as humans, we have this tendency to want this very simple answer. And there are situations where the simple answer is actually the right answer. But for a lot of things, that's just not the case. And when we're looking at what are the things that are contributing to one's health, I mean, there are thousands of things, like literally thousands of things that are having an
Yeah.
impact on that. And to say that it's all because of sugar, or it's all because of gluten, or it's all because of
Yeah.
weight, or it's none of those statements are true. And I think
Yeah.
we run into problems when we're trying to get into this very reductionist way. And
Yes.
even with myself,
Yeah.
like I talk about eating disorders being low energy issues, and that when you get in a low energy state, these things happen. And like that is a big component of it and a big driver, but there are so many other
Hmm.
pieces
Yeah.
that are there.
Yeah.
And if I'm saying like that's the only thing, then we're really missing some stuff here.
Yeah.
I like let's have a caveat. Let's be context specific.
Yeah.
Let's think about, okay, where are the edge cases? Where does this thing start to break down? And now this thing isn't actually true. Like that for me was always quite fascinating of like, okay, what
Yes.
about this scenario?
Yes.
Let's find that. And look, for someone recovering from an eating disorder, going through some of those thought experiments might not be the greatest thing to do. Like your
Yeah.
eating disorder is already prompting that kind of thinking that then gets in the way of action taking.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think there are situations where it is really useful to notice that there could be 10, 12 explanations for this thing as opposed to
Yeah.
just the one.
Yeah. And also nuance and complexity. I mean, we want things to be left or right, up or down, but there is all that space in between. And, so I think we really need to be aware of that and the fact that everything is on a spectrum. I mean, certainly with hypothalamic amenorrhea, your hypothalamus operates on a spectrum. Like you can have a completely working hypothalamus, very regular normal menstrual cycles. You can have somebody who's hormonally recovered, so their FSH and LH are normal, but they're just not getting the signal to start the follicular growth process. So I sort of put that right next to the normal working hypothalamus. You can have a hypothalamus that's slightly suppressed, so it doesn't take too much work to get back to normal. You can have a hypothalamus that's super suppressed. So, that's totally on a continuum. All of biology is on a continuum. There's really nothing that I know of that's one or zero. We're sort of talking about the whole everything in between.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And kind of connected to this conversation around trusting sources and understanding research and all of that, where do you land in terms of the social media piece? Because then, as you said, there's a lot more recovery coaches that are around now than were 5 or 10 years ago, or 10 years ago probably wasn't even a thing back then when we're talking about HA recovery coaches. And so there is so much more stuff on Instagram and TikTok
Mhm.
and so, yeah, how would you be suggesting people are navigating this?
Come from? What is your scientific basis for that? Like there is none as far as I'm aware. I'm happy to be proven wrong. Like
Yeah,
if somebody listening has a source that tells me that 70% carbs is the right thing for, period recovery, eating disorder recovery, whatever, please share it with me. But I don't think it exists. So, things like that, where people maybe that one person ate 70% carbs for their recovery. And so now they're like, this is what everyone should do. I mean, so stuff like that, any kind of proclamation. I mean, even the calorie recommendations that I give in the book, I have a table for daily energy requirements that, there's some variation depending on how tall you are. It makes sense because somebody who's, say, 7 feet tall as an edge case is obviously going to have higher energy needs than somebody who's 4 feet tall. And, so I think but obviously it's easier on social media to say 2,500 calories than like this, that, or the other thing. And as we were discussing earlier, like I don't really think the number is that important. It's really just to give people a guideline. But so I think any stringent recommendations like that, I think just ask, where is that coming from? What's the basis? Does it make sense that you need 70% carbs and not 69% and not 71%? No. I mean, so it is challenging. And, again, I think that the fear that comes or the perfectionism that comes around that, like if you're told you have to have 70% carbs, well, then you feel like, you need to be weighing and measuring and, really checking, like, do I have 70% carbs? And that just, I think those kinds of recommendations can drive perfectionism and are super important and, all of that kind of stuff.
yeah. And so I guess it's finding people on social media where one, they're giving you their sources, but two, there is more nuance that is
Yeah.
there. Because it's not that I'm against making a comment like having a high amount of carbohydrates can be very important for someone getting their period back for these types of reasons. Because actually, we know carbohydrates are really important for the brain, and based on this bit of research, it would indicate this thing. And so I'm not against any of that. But as you say, it's when you get into very specific, but also like very confident
Yeah.
of this to be
Yes.
true. And look, there are definitely things that I talk about on social media, which I am very confident on. And that
Yes.
I also want to let people know that I'm very confident on because I think that's a really important thing. But I'm not going to do that for everything. And I'm not going to do that for something where I'm like, there is a lot of variation
Yeah.
here.
Is people who say, I'll get your period back in 3 months.
Yeah.
That kind of certainty really, it really upsets me, honestly, because, where's the evidence to support that? How many people have you helped get their period back in 3 months? Sort of gives you this further idea, like, I'm not doing recovery right. What do I need to do more that I can get my period's not back in 3 months? What's wrong with me? And again, it removes so much of the nuance from the recovery process. I mean, we are all different. Like, sure, some people can get their period back in 3 months. It happens. Some people can take 6 months, 9 months, a year. And it really, there's so many variables that play into that. Where you started from, what exactly are you doing for your recovery? How sensitive is your hormonal system? What else is going on in your life? What stressors do you have? I mean, there's just so many different factors to
Yeah.
just boil it down and say, work with me and you'll get your period back in 3 months, I almost kind of think it's unethical for purposes.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I get this question all the time in terms of how long will this take? And I'm answering the same way as you of there are lots of variables
Yeah.
that are going to have an impact on this. How long this has been going on, how much of an impact this has made on your physiology, because something can be going on for a long time, but there's been just a small amount under what the body needed, and something's been going on a long time, and it's been a long way under what the body needed.
Yeah.
It's also impacted by how much change is someone going to make? Like, what are
Yeah.
you going to do in terms of reducing or stopping your exercise? What are you going to do in terms of increasing the amount of energy that you have coming in? What are you going to do in terms of your propensity to challenge your fears? And so, yeah, typically if I'm given that question, I'm giving someone a range of like at the
Yes.
absolute low end of things, it would be this, and at the
Yeah.
higher end, it would be this, and it just depends on
Yeah.
variables that aren't in your control and some variables that are in your control. People ask like how much weight will I gain as part of this
Hmm.
process, and I'm always very blunt about I don't know, and I
Yeah.
know that's not the answer you want to hear, and I'd
Yeah.
love to be able to give you a specific number, but if I did, I would be lying to you. I don't
Yeah.
know.
And
And
also, when I think a big part of this recovery process is getting away from putting importance on weight.
yeah,
So, it's absolutely a question that people ask, but I really try and encourage people to just not focus on that. Focus on this is what I need to do to nourish my body, and I'm going to allow my body to get to where it wants to be,
yeah,
and that's out of my control.
yeah, yeah. Being more okay with uncertainty and not knowing, and yeah, you can not enjoy that, and it can be a little
Yeah.
uncomfortable, and that can still be there. And I'm still making the changes that I need to as part of recovery.
Some of the people who recover their period but aren't necessarily still have some challenging behaviors, maybe. And, I think that letting go of control, letting go of focusing on your appearance as the be all end all, I think is a really big part of that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've done a podcast on it before, but I've been thinking about this a lot because it's come up in the last week a couple of times with
Mhm.
clients. And I think true freedom lies on the other end of pushing past what you thought was acceptable.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard when you get your period back when you've just done a little more than what you were doing before, or when
Hmm.
you took your eating or your exercise down just a little bit, because you're still within those same parameters that you were always in.
Yeah.
And so then you've never really broken out of that. And so even though I've had this change occur and it still feels positive, I really haven't broken away from the shackles of what was keeping me here to start with. And it's really, man, I never thought I was going to be able to eat this amount of food, but here we
Hmm.
are. Or
Yeah.
I never thought that I would be able to go past that number on the scale, and here we are. And people think that that's the most terrifying thing, and that is
Mhm.
actually the most liberating thing
Yes.
because it's now I'm not trying to hold on to anything. Like, should I add a salad at lunch? Like, I've blown past the relevance of that a long time ago. So I don't even get caught in that kind of thinking because it now seems so a drop in the ocean compared
Yeah.
to everything else. And I think that is where you then truly do get to that place because then you're not in the, oh gosh, could I have 2 days of exercise off a week and how could I deal with that as opposed to like, yeah, I just took 3 months off. Like
Yeah.
we're good. Like I can
Yes.
do 2 days off a week.
Yes.
And I think that's like it feels like that's the scariest thing ever, but that's the thing that actually really does allow you to get the freedom that you're after.
100% agree.
Yeah. What have we not hit today that you wanna hit? I can see we're kind of coming up on time. But what else have we not chatted about that you want to make sure we cover, if there is anything?
For February of next year.
Okay.
So working with me on HA recovery, and I sort of talked about doing this for quite a while, and it's sort of got backburnered to doing the translations, and so it's something that I think will hopefully benefit a lot of people. I think it'll benefit me.
Yeah.
It's just a different paradigm for doing things. So I'm excited to see how it goes. So it'll be a live course for the first time, and then I might do recordings and do a less interactive course going forward. But we'll just see how it goes. I think my end goal is to do a course for providers and possibly physicians. So the other thing I'm working on is I am partnering with Dr. Cassandra Schufelt at Mayo to work on the Reveal study and do some of the data analysis, because then once we publish, then I can go to conferences and talk to researchers and physicians and sort of help spread the word about HA in that arena. So that's sort of that's sort of where I'm heading. So working with individual clients now, and in perpetuity, I think, because it's something that I really get a lot of personal satisfaction out of, helping people recover their periods and have babies and, recover their freedom around food and exercise. And, so I get a lot of joy out of that. But I also want to, I want to keep working on increasing awareness and, spreading the good word about,
Yeah.
reducing focus on weight to physicians, and sort of that's my longer term path. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm excited about the course to start with, and that's sort of a stepping stone in this direction.
For sure. No, and so what's included as part of the course? Do you have those things all deep hammered down
Yeah,
yet or
so I
hammered
have, I
out?
mean, so we'll talk about, sort of diagnosis and understanding where your HA came from, and, both from a physical standpoint and from a mental standpoint, talking about changes in food and exercise to sort of help with recovery. So those will sort of be in the first 2 weeks. I'm planning to do 2 classes a week for the first 2 weeks, because I feel like there's so much I want to get to people to start
Yep.
with. And then we'll do following on from that a little bit more slowly. So talking about, body image and the mental side of things. I might have Florence come in and help me with that one. And then, learning about tracking ovulation and the importance of that, longer term, recovery, and sort of, maybe adding back exercise over time. But I think, I'm planning sort of a bonus session, a few months out, so that we can sort of have a check in and, see how things are going for people, and really, come back and talk about, issues that have come up and questions and all of that. And I'll also be doing weekly office hours so that people can connect with me on a more informal basis and just, talk about what's going on. And, I'm sort of hoping to develop the course, together in conjunction with the people who are taking it, because I feel like a lot of times it's sort of like, this is what you need to know. And I want to hear from people who are actually enrolled, like, what is most helpful for you and what do you want to work on? And, how can I support you in your recovery?
Nice. And look, I mean,
Yeah.
that was what I did when I created my program. Like I did a
Mhm.
beta version, did everything live, looked at what were the questions that came up, what was the feedback, how it worked, and then sat down and recorded
Yeah.
everything, because it's a
Mhm.
huge undertaking to do
Yeah.
that, and you want to know that you're on the right path. And
Yeah.
actually, by going through that beta group with it, there was a lot of it that I kept, but I actually came up with a framework that then felt like it made sense of it for
Mhm.
how it sat together. And so, yeah, I think doing this sort of iterative process as things evolve through what you notice people are
Yeah.
really liking, or that thing just doesn't seem quite as relevant as I thought it was going to be. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's awesome. And one of the questions I was going to ask at the top was, I know you're now seeing people as clients, and
Mhm.
that wasn't something you were doing previously. So how has that shifted? It has.
I think I've been seeing clients since probably since 2016-ish.
Okay. So
But yeah,
maybe it had happened after the
yeah,
first one, and we didn't touch on it after the second, or we
yeah.
touched on it in a minor way after the second. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I've learned from working directly with people is, everybody's different, and really digging in and seeing, like, what are your daily habits and how can we sort of make small changes to those, and big changes sometimes,
Yeah.
to sort of support you in your recovery. And I think a lot more of the psychology side of things. Again, not a trained therapist, anything like that, but really, the questions that people ask, I think I'm really nicely able to provide reassurance. And I think that that's something that really comes through sort of in person versus, reading the book or reading blog posts or what have you. I think that the personal reassurance side of things is really probably what's most helpful to people in working with me directly, is, being able to answer questions and know that you're getting, an answer that's well thought out and, backed by evidence. And I will tell you when I don't have evidence for something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I think that's probably the biggest thing is just the personal interaction part of it. And I think that's what I enjoy as well, is really being able to support people in their journey.
Yeah, nice. And for any new practitioners listening, there is nothing wrong with saying I don't know. Like I
Mhm.
think in the beginning, there's always this feeling of
Yes.
like, oh, I don't want to say
Yeah.
that. And I think there's actually a lot of power in being able to say, hey, I don't know that.
Yeah.
And I don't know that
And
for X, Y, and Z reason because we
yeah.
don't know that. Or actually, let me look into it and I'll come back to you
Yeah.
or whatever it is. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying I don't know.
Yeah. And I think really knowing what your own personal expertise is. Like I often get questions about thyroid, and I'm like, I can give you a little bit of information, but thyroid is not my specialty, and I'm not the right person for you to be talking to with that. And I think that's important too, like
Yep.
knowing what you know and knowing where you're not the right person. I have a client who actually, it turns out, has probably premature ovarian insufficiency, primary ovarian insufficiency, basically premature menopause. And she's gone to a number of different practitioners and they're just sort of, it's like scope creep. And I really don't like that. Obviously, HA recovery is different from premature menopause. And, can there be somebody who is underfueling and overexercising and experiences premature menopause? Absolutely. And it's still worth working on those things.
Yeah.
But saying that, do this and you're going to get your period back, and like, we need to really be careful about overdiagnosing in order to have people work with us. And I think that that's another problem that I see online is, somebody will start in one arena and then kind of move and move and move until they're trying to do everything. And you can't know everything about everything. And,
Yep.
so I think really sticking with a focus, which can move and change and grow, but not trying to be everything to everybody.
Yeah.
I think is important, and I don't do that. I will share with people when I know when we're in my area of expertise, and when we're stepping outside of it, and when we're well out of it. And I'm like, no, I can't help you with that.
Where can people go to find out more about you?
So my website is noperiodnowwhat.com. Links to most things are on there. If anyone's interested in the course, it's noperiod.info/course. I will have the contraception book available at probably on Amazon and the other places you can find my book, and also at noperiod.info/contraception. And if people want to work with me, that's noperiod.info/appointments. I have the noperiod.info/domain, and I like that as an easy way for people to find my stuff.
Well, look, I will put all of those links in the show notes. And yeah, thanks
Fantastic.
for coming on again. I can't believe it's been 6 years. It has flown
Yeah.
by. I always love getting to chat with you. For
Yes.
anyone who is suffering with HA and where this is something you're wanting information on, I highly recommend Nicola's book. It's an incredible resource.
Thank you
So
so
yeah,
much.
thanks for coming on.
Really, really
And
nice
yeah,
talking
I'll
with
speak
you
to you again
again.
soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
So that was my conversation with Dr. Nicola Sykes. It was lovely to be chatting with her again. Her book, No Period Now What, I highly recommend it. If you are struggling with HA and you're wanting to understand that better, you're wanting to know what are the different options with it, especially if you're wanting to get pregnant, it just covers everything connected to HA and HA recovery. So I highly recommend checking it out. That is it for this week's show. As I mentioned at the top, if you're wanting to recover from an eating disorder and to reach a place of full recovery, I would love to help you to get to that place. You can send an email to info@7-health.com and just put the word coaching in the subject line, and I can send over details. So that is it for this week. I'll be back with another show next week. Until then, take care, and I'll see you soon.